Picture a man sitting alone in his castle. He hasn't slept properly in 3 days. He flinches at sounds nobody else can hear. His hands won't stop shaking. He's been staring at the same wall since before dawn, and his servants are afraid to enter the room because the last one who did got a goblet thrown at his head hard enough to draw blood. This is not a peasant. This is not a criminal. This is a knight, a decorated war hero, a man who would have been on the front page of any newspaper in medieval Europe, a man who 6 months ago was riding into battle to cheers from an army that believed in him completely. And right now he is quietly losing his mind. This happened constantly in the medieval world. It was so common that the church built an entire bureaucratic system to try to handle it. It was so visible that a 14th century French knight felt compelled to write it down in a combat manual, not as a warning for young men to avoid the mental damage of war, but as a heads up that it was coming and there was no way around it. What you're about to hear is not what happened to a few unlucky individuals. This is what the system of medieval knighthood reliably, predictably, repeatedly did to the men who practiced it. And some of those men, when they broke in ways that history still hasn't fully reckoned with. Let's start on a battlefield, because that's where it started for all of them. It's the middle of a campaign. Could be France, could be the Holy Land, could be Scotland, doesn't matter. What matters is that you have been sleeping on frozen or mud-soaked ground for 6 weeks, not occasionally, every night. Your armor does not come fully off. You don't get a fire every night. You eat whatever the foragers find, which is sometimes nothing, and you eat it cold. And you're drinking ale because the water in this part of the country will kill you faster than the enemy will. You haven't bathed in a month. You have an untreated wound on your left arm that's beginning to smell wrong. You have killed 11 men that you can count. Some of them you killed with your sword, which is close enough that you saw their faces. You have watched your best friend bleed out from a neck wound in the mud while you held him and couldn't do anything, and the battle kept moving around you, and eventually you had to let go and stand up and keep fighting. You have been in this state continuously for 6 weeks, and your commander has just told you the campaign is being extended. A 14th century French knight named Geoffroy de Charny, one of the most celebrated warriors of his era, the man appointed to carry the oriflamme, France's most sacred battle banner, wrote about this exact experience, not as history, as a description of his own life and the lives of every man like him. He wrote, "In this profession one has to endure heat, hunger, and hard work, to sleep little and often to keep watch, and to be exhausted, and to sleep uncomfortably on the ground only to be abruptly awakened. You will be powerless to change the situation. You will often be afraid when you see your enemies coming towards you with lowered lances to run you through and with drawn swords to cut you down. Bolts and arrows come at you, and you do not know how best to protect yourself. You see people killing each other, fleeing, dying, and being taken prisoner, and you see the bodies of your dead friends lying before you." He wrote that as advice for young men considering whether to become knights. That quote is not from a therapist's case notes. It's not from a modern historian's analysis. It's from a man who lived it in 1350. Describing the psychological contents of a career that everyone around him considered honorable and glorious. He knew what it did. He watched it happen to himself and the men around him. And he thought the most useful thing he could do with that knowledge was warn the next generation that this was what they were signing up for, and that the only thing that got you through it was a quality of will that most men simply did not possess. He was right. Most men didn't possess it. And when the wall broke, it broke in specific, predictable, and sometimes catastrophic ways. The drinking was the most visible symptom and the most universal. Because medieval water was legitimately dangerous, contaminated, carrying disease, the kind of thing that killed more soldiers than swords did, knights drank constantly. Wine, ale, mead, whatever was available. Not occasionally with meals. From the moment they woke up to the moment they passed out, on campaign and off it. This wasn't considered alcoholism in the modern sense because there wasn't really a concept for it. It was considered normal. It was rational in a way. The alcohol really did kill the bacteria in the water, so drinking it was genuinely safer than not. But what chronic daily alcohol consumption does to a brain that is also chronically sleep-deprived and under prolonged stress is not complicated. It accelerates everything already going wrong. The flashbacks come harder. The emotional regulation, already demolished by exhaustion and trauma, collapses entirely. Men who had been on extended campaigns for years and returned home were frequently described in chronicles as changed, violent towards servants, unpredictable with family, unable to participate in peacetime social structures that required patience and self-control they no longer possessed. Their lords complained about them. Their wives wrote about them. The church received confession after confession from men describing impulses and behaviors that terrified them, that had not existed before the war. And then they were sent back to war because there was no mechanism for anything else. You were a knight. War was your function. The trauma would have to wait. Some of them found a specific grim escape in the tournament circuit. The medieval tournament was the closest thing the knightly class had to professional sport. Massive events, huge crowds, noble sponsors, prize money, reputation at stake. The centerpiece was the joust. 2 knights on war horses charging at each other from opposite ends of the field at a combined closing speed of roughly 50 miles per hour, each aiming a 10-foot lance at the other's helmet. Here's what that impact actually felt like. When a lance traveling at that speed struck the visor of a great helm, a helmet that was designed to enclose and protect the head by fitting tightly and not moving. The force transferred through the steel directly to the skull inside. The brain, floating in fluid, slammed against the inner wall of the skull. This is exactly the mechanism that modern sports medicine identifies as traumatic brain injury. The same physics that ends NFL careers. The same physics that researchers now find in autopsied brains as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The degenerative condition that causes personality changes, explosive rage, depression, paranoia, and eventually dementia. Medieval chronicles describe the aftermath of major joust impacts with a phrase that became almost routine. The knight had to be carried from the field. Carried, unable to walk, needing other men to move him. Modern medical professionals reading those accounts say that's a grade 3 concussion at minimum, possibly worse. And these men were not carried off, rested for 6 weeks as modern protocol demands, and gently monitored for returning symptoms. They were carried off, given wine, and encouraged to ride again the next day. Because the tournament lasted multiple days and each day of competition affected your standing. They did it again and again, season after season, year after year, because the tournament was the only socially acceptable arena for the violence that was boiling inside them. It was a legal outlet for aggression that had nowhere else to go. It paid money. It built reputation. And somewhere in the middle of a 50-mile-per-hour lance impact for a few seconds, the noise in their heads stopped. The price was their brains. And we have the receipts. Henry VIII of England is famous for the 6 wives, the executions, the paranoia, the bloated, terrifying figure of his later years who had courtiers trembling and sent 2 queens to the scaffold. What is less famous, but far better documented than most people realize, is the head injury file. In 1524, Henry was jousting at Greenwich when his opponent's lance found its way through his open visor and shattered inside his helmet, sending splinters through the space where his face was. He was knocked off his horse. He continued jousting for the rest of the day. He began complaining of recurrent headaches shortly afterward. In 1525, he was hawking, a leisure activity, when he attempted to vault a ditch with a pole that snapped under his weight, and he drove headfirst into the mud at the bottom. A courtier had to physically haul him out before he drowned. Another concussion. In January 1536, he was jousting at a tournament at Greenwich Palace when his horse fell on top of him in full armor. Henry lay unconscious on the ground for 2 hours. 2 hours, not stunned, unconscious. The court panicked. His pregnant wife, Anne Boleyn, told of the accident, reportedly miscarried shortly thereafter. Before 1536, Henry was described by contemporaries as charming, intelligent, generous, and politically shrewd. After 1536, the records describe a different man, explosive rages that arrived without warning, memory gaps. Courtiers noted that Henry would sometimes angrily deny things had been agreed in meetings he had personally attended. Paranoia about betrayal and assassination. The executions that characterized his later reign began to accelerate. The personality was not recognizable as the same person who had played tennis, composed music, and been celebrated across Europe as the ideal Renaissance prince. A peer-reviewed paper published in the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience in 2016 laid out the case directly. The documented head injuries, the behavioral timeline, the symptoms as they progressed. The authors concluded that Henry's post-1536 personality changes were consistent with the kind of frontal lobe damage and white matter disruption now associated with chronic traumatic encephalopathy from repeated head trauma. The cruelty was not a mystery. It was a diagnosis, and it had been building since 1524 for 12 years. With every joust, he refused to give up. Henry was a king, so everyone wrote things down. For every Henry, there were hundreds of ordinary knights suffering the same degradation in silence, with nobody recording what was happening to them, their estates slowly failing, their families quietly suffering, their lords replacing them with younger men who hadn't yet been broken. And then there is Gilles de Rais. If you want to understand how far a man can fall, how completely the combination of war trauma, institutional breakdown, and total psychological collapse can transform a celebrated human being into something that seems barely human, Gilles de Rais is the case study. And he was real. He was born in 1404 to one of the richest families in France. By his late teens, he was already a military commander. In 1429, he was assigned to fight alongside Joan of Arc, the woman who had convinced the French that God was on their side and that the English could be driven out. He rode beside her. He fought at Orléans, where the siege that was supposed to end France broke and the English ran. He was at her side at battle after battle, watching an illiterate peasant girl in a suit of armor lead professional soldiers to victories that military logic said were impossible. He was at her side when they captured prisoners, when the screaming happened, when the bodies were dealt with, when night fell and they camped in fields that 2 hours earlier had been slaughterhouses. He was 25 years old when Joan of Arc was handed to the English and burned at the stake. He watched it happen. He was granted the title Marshal of France, the highest military honor the kingdom could give. He went home. And then Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, war hero, the man who had ridden beside France's most beloved saint, began to come apart at the seams in ways that the 15th century had no framework to understand. He started spending his money at a rate that seemed designed for self-destruction. He commissioned theatrical productions, enormous extravagant recreations of the battles he had fought alongside Joan. He hired casts of hundreds, built sets, spent the equivalent of multiple castle estates producing a show about the siege of Orléans over and over, as if replaying the one period of his life that had made sense would somehow put him back together. He was, by every behavioral marker, a man trying to live inside a moment that was already gone, spending himself into ruin trying to touch it one more time. Then the children started disappearing. From the villages around his castle at Tiffauges, children, boys between 6 and 18, began to vanish. Peasant children, pages, boys who had been brought to the castle to sing, to act in the productions, to serve. None of them came back. For years, no one was powerful enough to act on the rumors because Gilles de Rais was the Marshal of France, and you did not accuse the Marshal of France. In 1440, investigators finally moved. The trial records survive. When Gilles de Rais testified under oath, what he confessed to was of such specific, deliberate, systematic horror that the court scribes, men who had spent their careers recording confessions, reportedly stopped writing at certain points because they could not continue. He confessed to murdering somewhere between 80 and 200 children. Some historians believe the true number was substantially higher. He said in court that by the end, he had killed so many, he had lost count. He was hanged and burned on October 26th, 1440. The psychological and criminal literature that has built up around his case over the past century keeps circling back to the same question. Was this a man who was always a monster, hiding beneath a decorated surface? Or was this a man who was built by war, by witnessing Joan's execution, by years of unprocessed trauma, by the total absence of any structure or purpose in peacetime, into something that the knight who rode into Orléans in 1429 would not have recognized as himself? There's no clean answer. There rarely is with this. What is clear is that the collapse of Gilles de Rais followed a pattern that appears, in less extreme versions, throughout the records of medieval knights who came home from long wars and could not find their way back to ordinary life. The extravagant spending on spectacle, the inability to function within peacetime social structures, the escalating behavior that kept testing where the walls were, the sense of being unmoored from everything that had previously given life meaning. It is the pattern of a man whose entire identity had been built around a specific context: war, mission, purpose, someone to follow, and who, when that context ended, had nothing left inside to organize himself around. The church had seen this before Gilles de Rais, and it would see it again after. After the Norman conquest in 1066, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued a document instructing priests on how to handle knights who had killed. The penance was calibrated to the killing. So many days of fasting for each man slain, more for killing outside the direct heat of battle, more still for killing a priest or a woman or a child. The structure was not primarily spiritual. It was psychological. It forced the returning warrior to articulate what he had done, to sit with it in the presence of another human being, to perform an act of acknowledgement that the violence had been real and had cost something. It was, in function, if not in name, a form of structured decompression, community-based, public, ritualized. It worked for the men who came home from single campaigns and were genuinely trying to return to ordinary life. It did not work for the men who had been on campaign for 15 consecutive years, who had killed hundreds of people, who had accumulated damage at a rate that no amount of fasting and prayer could metabolize. Those men came home carrying something the church's system wasn't built to hold. And when it spilled, when the drinking got worse, When the nightmares became screaming, when the hands that had held swords couldn't stop shaking, when the violence that had been pointed outward at enemies turned inward at wives and servants and anyone who happened to be in the room, the medieval world had only one real answer: rest, pray. And when the next war comes, ride out again. Because the only thing that ever made the noise stop, really stop completely for more than a few hours, was combat. The simplicity of it, the clarity of an enemy in front of you and a sword in your hand and no ambiguity about what you were supposed to do. The peace that descended in the middle of a battle when every other thought disappeared was the only peace many of these men ever found. And when the war ended and that peace went away and left only the wreckage of everything they'd done to get it, they didn't know how to be alive anymore. Henry VIII had jousting because it was the next best thing. Gilles de Rais had theatrical productions and alchemy and eventually something far darker. The ordinary knights, the ones whose names didn't make it into the chronicles, had the alehouse and the fighting and the slow disintegration of everything around them that nobody thought to write down because it was too common to be remarkable. Here's the thing about this that should settle into you. The medieval world looked at these men and saw knights, warriors, decorated servants of God and King. It saw the armor and the title and the lineage, and it did not have language for what was happening inside them. The damage was real. The suffering was real. The consequences for them, for their families, for the people around them who had no protection from what they had become, were real. We invented the word PTSD in 1980. We are still learning what it means and how to treat it. The men in these stories were experiencing it 600 years earlier with no word, no treatment, no acknowledgement that what was happening to them was even possible. They went insane because the world they were trained for broke them, and then it sent them home and expected them to be fine. Most of them weren't. Subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments which part of this kept you thinking afterward.